knowledge. Isn't that true? Think of where we're at. Kurth is in Greece. All the great philosophers with all their great Greek wisdom couldn't solve the problems in Corinth. But the Apostle Paul preached the grace of God. And let me tell you something. Every problem you have, God's grace can solve. You believe that? Every problem you have, God's grace can solve. Every problem in the Corinthian church, God's grace solved, or was on their way to solving. Look at verse 7. Verse 7, he says, have I committed an offense in abasing myself, that ye might be exalted? Listen, Paul was an intellectual. Paul could have gone to Corinth and tore them limb from limb, intellectually speaking. He could have blasted these intellectuals, these philosophers. He says, I didn't do that. Well, he says, when I got there, I abased myself. I preached Christ and Him crucified. The simple gospel of the grace of God. And you know what? I think it was hard for Paul to do that. Because he knew he could take them. He knew he was their intellectual match. You know, as a house painter over the years, most of the time I worked for myself as an independent contractor. But a couple of times I worked with other painters. And one time I worked for another painter. Work was slow in this area, and there was a painter I knew that went to Pastor Jordan's church. Doesn't anymore. He's mad at him about something. But so I traveled to the north side, and he needed help because he got the job for this humongous office complex. And so he said to me, he says, go paint that room over there. And boy, I was eager to strut my stuff and show what I could do as a painter. And the first thing I did was spill paint on the floor. Now, it didn't matter because if you know anything about new construction, with a concrete floor, it was going to get carpeted or wood floor over it, or we didn't even bother. The reason I spilled paint on the floor is because I didn't even bother to put a drop cloth down because I knew we didn't have to protect the floor. But I sure didn't get to strut my stuff as a painter. And the first thing I had to do was go tell them I spilled a gallon of paint. What can they, I need some help cleaning this up. I didn't bring anything to clean it up. Last year, I played softball on the Kettle Marine team, and I was eager to strut my stuff and show that I knew how to play baseball, you know. And so the first day out, I hadn't done anything physical in so long, I really strutted my stuff. And then I was at the doctor the following week because I hurt my arm, and the thing hurt for about a month or two. Shouldn't have, Barb, she didn't know that was why it happened. And confession time. But you know what it is. When you know you're the equal of these people who are good at something, you want to show you. It was hard for Paul to abase himself, I have a feeling. So why didn't he do it? Well, we're going to talk about that. It says, have I committed an offense in abasing myself, that you might be exalted? Paul says, I could have brought messages from human wisdom. I could have preached the truth and matched these intellectuals, he says, but the power wouldn't have been there. The power of the Word of God is in the simple, plain gospel. The simple message. So he says, I abased myself that you might be exalted. Human wisdom can't exalt people, friends. They think it can. Come to our universities and get all you can. I'm not against higher education. I was at my wife's graduation yesterday for higher education. But listen, the idea that it exalts man to where the grace of God exalts man. That's what Paul is saying here. The grace of God doesn't just save people, it exalts them. The rescue missions, they don't just save the bum out of the gutter, they exalt them. Brother Sermons was up for Pastor Jordan's conference, and he did a little sightseeing in Chicago. He said, I drove by Pacific Art Mission. I said, were there any men in suits out in front of the building handing out gospel tracts? I said, because usually there are, and usually those are men that they did lift out of the gutter, and they did more than just get them out of the gutter. They exalted them to the ministry. That's what the grace of God does. Doesn't just save. It exalts even in a place like Corinth. Even among the carnal Corinthians, there is hope for the most hopeless person, dear friends, in the grace of God. The grace of God exalts people. And not just for a while. And not just a few people. Every year the American Idol show, which I've never seen, I understand it exalts one, sometimes two people. Because I understand the runner-up sometimes gets as famous as the guy who wins. Oh man, the grace of God has exalted millions. Millions of people. It exalts fathers and husbands, unlike television. If you've watched any TV and the sitcoms and stuff, there is an onslaught of attack against the American husband and father. They want to make us all look like Homer Simpson. You notice that? The grace of God exalts the husband and the father in the home. The grace of God exalts the wife and mother. People say, oh, wait a minute, Paul was a sexist. Oh, yeah, right. Let's compare Christianity as it exists here in the United States to the Muslim countries and how they treat women. You know, there's a big thing over there right now because they're getting a little brave. They're not wearing their heads and their hair dress. What do they call that thing they wear? They're not covering all their hair. They're gonna go to court. They're gonna do legislation. Oh man! The grace of God exalts husbands, fathers, wives, and mothers. The grace of God in the Pauline epistles exalts slaves. I'll give you some more homework. Romans 16. Paul sends greetings from two people in the same verse. One of them, he says he's a chamberlain in the city. He was a city official in the city of Corinth. I think he was writing Romans, right? And then he says, and he sends greetings, and you know who else sends greetings? Kurth, a brother. And Kurth was a slave. You know how we know that? You know what Kurth means? Fourth. They didn't bother to name the slaves. You're number 1, you're 2, you're 3. There's another guy named Secundus in the Bible. In the same verse, say, the chamberlain of the city says hello along with the slave. The grace of God exalts people. And no matter who you are today, no matter how humble your position, your status in life, your job, whatever it be, the grace of God can exalt you if you let it, if you'll learn it. That's why we assemble here each week, to study the grace of God. Well, Paul abased himself. Paul abased himself by being simple in Corinth. But if you've read the rest of the verse here in verse 7, he also abased himself in another way. Verse 7 says, have I committed an offense in abasing myself, that ye might be exalted, because I preached to you the gospel of God freely. You know what? In the city of Corinth, the Apostle Paul, and when he got done preaching, didn't pass an offering plate, and he didn't have a box on the wall. In the city of Corinth, how did he support himself? Anybody? Read Acts chapter 18. By making tents with Priscilla and Aquila, who were also tent makers. Now, look at that verse and think, how